Just as Grace and Alex found each other, our community is looking for you. Join our family, subscribe to our channel, and celebrate the little miracles in life together. Lukas still wandered the halls of nightmares. No, not dreams. Memories, a woman's voice insisted, her words punctuated by the scream of brakes, the shriek of metal colliding with metal. Remember. Listen to me. This is what really happened. He obeyed. But felt as if he were a stranger in his own mind, watching as he steered a car through the night. Right? Driving home from the airport. But he didn't drive, did he? His throat tightened. Grace was with him. He looked down, saw her left hand resting on his thigh, her platinum diamond engagement, and wedding rings gleaming silver in the dashboard lights. Why couldn't he feel her? He looked up in panic, caught a glimpse of her smile, the rest of her face shrouded in shadow. Married, they were married, she was his. Forever. She loved him. Forever. The thought should have soothed, instead it created more panic. He tried to move his hand, reach out to touch her, to prove that she was real, but he was frozen in place. Then came a mind-splitting crash. As he watched, Grace flew face first through the windshield, glass and blood raining down on him. He heard her screams, tasted her blood splattered on his face, felt her flesh give beneath his fists. No, no, the strange voice insisted. It wasn't like that. He opened his hand and the bloody chair leg he'd been holding vanished, replaced by the seatbelt buckle, as he fought to get free of the twisted wreckage to get to Grace. To save her. He had to save her. He was her only hope. Then a man's face intruded. Jimmy Moran. At first staggering with a drunken gait, grinning like a maniac at the chaos he'd wreaked. Lukas felt the howl of rage and fury thunder through him. Moran sat down on the asphalt beside Grace, dared to touch her. Then Moran lay below Lukas, his face ravished, shattered. Lukas tightened his grip around the man's throat, ignoring the blood seeping onto the oak floor. No, not oak, asphalt. Then Grace died in his arms, reaching for him, her wedding ring gleaming in the headlights. Silver and diamonds casting rainbows in the mist. He hadn't been able to save her. A single tear slid from beneath his eyelid, but Lukas was frozen in place. Unable to raise a hand to wipe it away. Jimmy bolted through the door to Alex's room, then stopped short. Seated on the chair, playing cards flying from his hands as he dealt them onto the bedside table, was Leo. Attired now in black turtleneck and black jeans, he looked like a silver-maned David Copperfield. "Ah, Jimmy," he drawled, cards flying seemingly in random directions, "glad you were able to join us." He paused in his movements to toss Jimmy a towel, then turned back to Alex and Kat. "I was just explaining to Alexander and Catherine that they shouldn't blame themselves for Grace deciding to have her surgery. That it was her own free will." Jimmy chucked the towel back at Leo, disrupting the intricate design of the cards. "You bastard," he thundered, stalking past Alex's bed. The children looked up at him in surprise that quickly changed to fear. "Jimmy, what's wrong?" Alex asked. He ignored the boy, stepped closer to the monk. "You knew what was over there, waiting for her." Leo stood, met Jimmy's glare with a placid gaze, his dark eyes mirroring Jimmy's scowl. "The point, my boy, is that so did she." His voice was as cold as an Arctic breeze. Grace knew what was waiting for her, yet still she chose to go. "Believe me, it's not the outcome I'd hoped for. I brought you here to prevent all this. To stop Eve from unleashing her cursed drug on the world." "But," he shrugged, "free will. Free will my Aunt Minnie's ass. You drove Grace to this. Keeping her here, involving her with them." Jimmy jerked his head at the two children. "Bringing me in when she almost broke free on her own. You set her up from the start." Leo smiled, and Jimmy's blood ran cold. It was the smile of a man who had nothing more to lose, the grin of a madman. He nonchalantly fanned out the remainder of the cards between his long fingers. I guess your love wasn't as strong as you thought. Welcome to my world. You'll get used to the frustration and impotence after a while if you stick around. Maybe a few 100 years or so. Pick a card, Jimmy. Any card. To hell with you and your parlor tricks. I'm getting my wife back. You mean your widow, don't you, boyo? Leo thrust the cards into Jimmy's face. Kat joined Alex on the bed, was holding him tight as both children listened to the argument. Go ahead, Leo continued. No more tricks. Pick a card and see your future. Bugger my future. Show me Grace's. Prove to me that she'll be all right. No guarantees. Just likelihoods. That pesky free will again, you know. Okay, 2 for 1. We'll let the children do the picking. Leo spun around. Kat and Alex drew back as far as they could, their faces growing pale. Alexander, you chose for Jimmy. Leo followed his command with a stare. Alex reached a trembling hand forward, his breath whistling as he exhaled. Bloody hell. Jimmy's heart wrenched at the sight of the two terrified kids. He cursed himself for starting this in front of them. Leave them out of it. He grabbed a card and flipped it face up onto the table. The Joker, his fool's cap flying from his head, as he pedaled his bicycle furiously through empty air, falling. The ground below was an inferno of greedy flames reaching up, trying to snatch him from the sky. I guess this means I will see you in hell. Or what passes for it. Jimmy flung the card at Leo. Now get out of here. Someone needs to be with Grace and you know I can't go. Leo seemed to appear honestly dismayed, his dark eyes pulling away from Jimmy, searching the room. Would that I could, Jimmy. Would that I could. His voice was so wistful Jimmy almost believed him. My power goes no further than yours. That's why I needed Grace in the first place. Jimmy blew his breath out in frustration. He turned to the children. Do either of you know Dr. Hellman? I need to talk to him, convince him to bring Grace back from the tower. I know him, Kat said, her voice emerging as a tremulous squeak. He's my doctor. You're not going to convince anyone of anything looking like that, man, Leo put in, nodding to Jimmy's soaking wet scrubs and disheveled appearance. He tossed the cards aside and stood, suddenly full of energy as if Jimmy's words had brought him new hope. You go. Wait and watch for Grace. I'll take the children and discuss the issue with Jonas. Yes, Jonas is the perfect one to approach, Vincent will listen to him. We might still have a sliver of hope there. Jonas. So now you two are mates. How do I know I can trust you? You can trust us, Alex said. His words cut through the air like the chime of crystal. Both men spun to face him. We won't let anything happen to Grace. I promise. Dr. Hellman will listen to me, Kat added. He always listens if you tell him what a good doctor he is and make him think something is his own idea. She spoke with the authority of experience. Jimmy sighed, turning his gaze on each child in turn, searching their earnest faces for reassurance. Finally he nodded. Trusting Grace's future to two babes barely out of nappies, but he felt the trust was well placed. Besides, he had nowhere else to turn. All right, then. But hurry. Please, he added, not caring that the last came out a sorrowful plea. Wait, Leo said. Don't you want to know Grace's future? Jimmy spun back and stared down the infuriatingly less than omnipotent monk. I know her future already, you bastard. Find someone else to play your bloody games with because I'm going to save her. Vincent, meet Renee's son. Lukas Redding. The strange tone of triumph in Eve's voice almost distracted Vincent from the name. Then it sank in. He whipped his head around to stare from mother to son. Lukas Redding appeared harmless, strapped to his gurney with 4-inch leather restraints, his face slack and innocent in sleep, a small dribble of drool slipping from his lips. Lukas Redding, he repeated in a hoarse whisper. The man who... Renee's hand stroked her son's head as she met Vincent's gaze with a sharp-edged glare. The man who needs your help, Dr. Embark, she said in a calm, commanding voice. The patient you and Dr. Warden can save. Vincent stared at her, saw only grim determination in her expression. The warped visage of a mother's love, driven to sacrifice anything or anyone for the sake of her child. Even if that child was a monster. He backed away from the Reddings, turned to find Eve busy draping ice packs over Grace's face and hands. Grace's eyes were wide open, staring unseeing at the ceiling, but her heart rate on the monitor had sped up, and he realized she had heard everything, knew exactly who she now shared her room with. Eve, what the hell are you doing? Vincent demanded. Wake her up, bring her back. Now? Eve finished tucking the last ice pack against Grace's cheek and looked up, tossing her hair back. Don't worry, she said. She'll be fine. A touch of beta blockers to slow her pulse and Lukas will think she's dead. He'll finally be able to say his goodbyes, let her go for once and for all. You can't, Eve, you can't do this to her. I won't let you. She arched an eyebrow at him, rounded the gurney and stepped close. She placed a hand on his chest as if she were pushing him away, but her fingernails dug in with a steel grip. You won't let me. Vincent, this is the answer to our dreams. The ultimate validation of lucidine therapy. Not to mention your way out of the mess your life has become, she paused. With Renee's help. You mean with Renee's money? Blood money. She narrowed her eyes as she tilted her head up to stare into his. Does it matter whose money it is? If it buys you the future you've always dreamed of. Her voice was hypnotic, a siren's song. The beeping of Grace's heart rate on the monitor sped up, drawing his attention back to the woman who lay helpless on the gurney. All that she had suffered already, how could he let Eve put her through this? I can't, he stammered, his gaze fixed on Grace's still form. I won't let you. Eve's laughter surprised him. He returned his focus to her, and saw that her cheeks were now blossoming with crimson. Her grip on his shirt and chest tightened, became painful. He circled his hands around her arms, tried to break free, but instead she forced him back against the wall. I think you will, she whispered as her free hand stroked his thigh and her body pressed up against his. If you want to save your lady, Grace. A hospital can be such a dangerous place, after all. Vincent stared down at her, amazed that this she-devil had ever seemed attractive to him. His flesh crawled beneath her touch. You might want to think about saving yourself as well, Vincent, she crooned. The patients aren't the only ones recorded. My office has a camera as well. No audio, but the video will speak for itself after I go to Hellman and tell him how you raped me last night. He tried to push her away, but her fingers tightened on him. I never, he whispered. That's exactly what happened. They'll investigate, find drugs in your call room. Drugs like Rohypnol, the date rape drug. Of course, I'll have to tell them how I found you in Kat's room when she was sleeping, watching her. And Grace, why else would you be interested in a crazy woman, near to death, the perfect victim, a woman no one would ever believe if she told them of your perversions? He shuddered beneath her touch and gulped for air. Sweat broke out all over him, his chest constricted as he worked to breathe. When I'm done with you, Vincent, she continued mercilessly, you'll be labeled a sexual predator, a rapist, pedophile. Losing your career to a malpractice case will be the least of your worries. She stepped back, her hands leaving his flesh, and he found air to breathe again. He realized that he still clutched her shoulders. His vision cleared enough to look past her to the blinking red light of the camera above her. He dropped his hands. She smiled in triumph. To the camera it would look like he had grabbed her, pulled her to him, maybe even against her will. She gave him a wink and he knew she had won. She had manipulated him, Grace. Hellman twisted reality into something macabre and bizarre. Eve's version of the truth would be the only one anyone saw or believed. "What do you want?" he asked, the words burning in his throat, making his stomach churn with loathing and disgust. "Simple. I am going to wake Lukas, allow him to say goodbye to Grace. You play the role of the pathologist, explain to him how she died of her injuries in the car accident." She gave him a mock frown of concern. "Be sure to tell him that she didn't suffer, that she went fast. Show him the body. Then Renee and I will take it from there. I'll put him back under, he'll wake up in his room, thinking that all this," she gestured to Grace in the room, "is a distant memory, happened 4 years ago. At least give Grace a sedative," he pleaded, his vision watching Grace's heartbeat racing along the monitor. "There's no reason to torture her. A little midazolam, something to let her forget." "You idiot. You really do care for her. Even after she nearly ruined everything." She pursed her lips in consideration. "You behave yourself, do exactly what I say and I'll erase her memories. She'll never remember today, never remember Lukas or what happened." "You can do that." She laughed once more. "Honey, with Lucidine, I can do anything. Give you ideas you never dreamed of and make you think they were yours, convince you how to vote, what kind of car to buy, help you forget any little bad thing that's been nagging at your conscience." Vincent watched in silence, as she gleefully removed the ice packs from Grace's body. Her face was even paler than before, her skin almost transparent. He touched her cheek. "Ice cold. It will be all right," he whispered to her as Eve disconnected the monitors and the sound of her heartbeat vanished. Eve pushed more drugs into the four, then disconnected it, folding Grace's hands over the sheet that covered her body. Vincent felt for the pulse in Grace's neck, it was almost non-existent. Eve backed away, gazed on her still life arrangement and nodded in approval. "Time to wake up our boy," she told Renee. Chapter 34 Faith in Nothing. Grace was helpless, more helpless than she'd ever been in her life. Unable to fight, unable to talk, unable even to blink. And she was mad as hell. Mad at Eve, mad at Vincent, but most of all furious with herself for not finding another way before it came to this. She'd given up, believed that since she soon would be dead, nothing that happened to her mattered anymore. She was wrong. Dead wrong. At least Jimmy wasn't here to witness her surrender. Never before in her life had she given up, not even when Lukas. Then he was there, his flat brown eyes staring into her unblinking ones. Her chest was tight, the muscles paralyzed so that she could barely draw in any air, but his presence made her feel like she was drowning. She fought her panic almost as much as she fought the drug that kept her helpless. "Grace," Lukas cried out, tears streaming down his face, splashing warm against her chilled skin. His fingers stroked her hair, pulled it back. "Oh my God, Grace." She almost felt compassion for the man hovering above her body. He truly was grief-stricken, brainwashed into believing that her death was an accident, that she had loved him as much as he loved her. Lies woven so seamlessly into his own delusions, she doubted if Lukas had any earthly idea what was reality, and what was illusion. Another thing Eve Warden had to answer for. Lukas was a monster, and curing him of his obsession with Grace would only free him to fixate on another innocent woman. How could Eve have ever believed this was a good use of her research, her talent? "She didn't suffer, Mr. Redding," Vincent's voice came from beyond her vision. Lukas took no comfort in the words. He fell sobbing to the floor, his head resting on Grace's chest. His tears soaked through the sheet that covered her, his weight adding to the pressure against her chest. Her vision darkened as she struggled for air. What if Lukas heard her breathe? Felt her heart beat? Grace froze, trying to still her vital processes, as much as the Lucidine had stilled her muscles. Vincent must have had the same thought because she saw his hands reach out to pull Lukas away. Two pairs of high heels clattered on the floor and Eve appeared on Lukas' other side, accompanied by another, older woman. Lukas' mother, Grace recognized from the preliminary hearing 4 years ago. Back then the woman had stared across the courtroom at Grace with the venomous glare of a death adder. "Come now, Lukas," she said in a tone of fake condolence. "Come home with me and everything will be all right." "First," Eve added, maneuvering a syringe from her pocket, "let me give you something to ease the pain." Lukas ignored the women, shoulders bowed as he wept. Eve reached for his arm and he shrugged her away. "No. I don't want any drugs. Lukas, it's for your own good. Now, be a good boy and do as the doctor says." Grace held her breath, prayed that he would obey his mother and leave. "End this nightmare." He nodded slowly, his head moving as if it were too heavy for his body. Then he reached for her hand once more. His fingers tightened on hers. At first a gentle pressure, then with a force that sent waves of pain down her arm. He wrenched at her ring finger, twisting the 2 gold bands there, tugging them free, revealing the thin ribbon of scar tissue they hid. "Not gold," he shouted, examining her wedding band in the bright light that glared down on her. "It's supposed to be a diamond." Her emerald engagement ring flashed as he waved it in Eve's face. "I gave her a diamond." Lukas' voice grew louder, his face flushed scarlet with fury. Eve took a step toward him, touched his arm. "Calm down, Lukas." Grace saw Eve's hand, the syringe ready to go, reach out toward him. Lukas spotted the movement as well, shoving Eve so hard that she skidded up against the door. He scowled down at the 2 rings in his hand, and then hurled them across the room into the utility sink. They hit the porcelain with the clash of bullets. "Lukas, please," his mother reached for his hand. "Don't do this. Let me help you." "You lied to me," he spat out the words. "You all lied to me." He raised his hand to strike his mother, but Vincent rushed him, pulling him away from Grace's field of vision. She heard the clatter of an instrument stand toppling, the crash of metal on the tile floor. The Lukas reappeared, holding the metal tray over his head like a club. Grace had no choice but to stare helplessly into the face of her killer. "Mrs. Redding intervened, tugging at her son's arm. "Lukas, they'll put you in jail again." "Why did you lie to me?" he asked, his gaze never leaving Grace's face. He lowered the tray. "Why did you tell me she was dead?" "Mrs. Redding drew close enough that Grace could see the lines of her lipstick feathering as she sneered. "She's as good as dead anyway. Forget about her, Lukas. You don't need her. All you need is me. You'll be there for me. Just like you always are." His voice emerged shrill, a child begging for attention. "Of course, Lukas. I'll always be here for you. You know that." "Yes, Mother. Yes, I do." He drew in a deep, shuddering breath. Grace fought against the drug, felt as if she could almost move her fingers. But then he raised the metal tray over his head once more, and she knew that wouldn't be enough. "Put that down and listen to me, Lukas," Renee shouted. "Do as I say or I won't let you come home with me. I'll leave you here forever." Lukas blinked hard, his eyes still locked onto Grace's. Then in one quick motion he whirled and slammed the edge of the tray into his mother's throat. Blood spurted out in an arc as she dropped to the floor. "Stop your lying, Mother. I can't take any more lies." Blood splattered Grace's face and body. The smell of death filled the air as the gurgled sounds coming from Lukas' mother faded into silence. Grace managed to blink away the blood burning her eyes. She tried to move her lips, to speak, but only a small squeak emerged. Lukas dropped the tray with a clatter. "I would never hurt you, Grace," he cried, tugging the blood-soaked sheet away from her and gathering her into his arms. "I love you. I'm here to save you." He gathered her into his arms and fled. Vincent saw Eve sidle out the door, and hoped she was getting security. Then Lukas threw him against the wall, and everything went blurry for a few seconds. He lay on the floor, his head throbbing, watching and listening as Lukas attacked his mother and took Grace. He staggered back to his feet. He could run after them, should run after them. But the look in Lukas' eyes. The corpse at his feet made up his mind. He cared for Grace, but he wasn't about to die for her. He tried to avoid the blood puddling around Mrs. Redding's body as he moved to the phone on the wall. Before he could dial, Eve pushed through the door, brandishing a large gun. "Where'd he go?" she demanded. Her face was flushed with streaks of angry red, and the force of her glare made him lose his voice for a moment. "He took Grace," he finally stuttered. "I don't know where." He pointed to the gun. "You don't need that. We'll be safe here until the police come." She tilted her head, staring at him with a half-smile, as if he were a strange creature from another planet that she'd stumbled upon. "I didn't call the police, Vincent. Lukas is our problem. We need to protect the Lucidine project." She nodded to the still recording camera. "Once I take care of him, we'll make sure there's no evidence that any of this happened." Her smile widened. "At least not this way. Eve?" He almost choked on her name, his throat was so tight. "A woman's dead. A patient kidnapped may be dead, as well if we don't stop him." She hefted the gun. "Don't worry. We'll stop him. Too bad Grace might accidentally get in the line of fire. But wouldn't that just solve all our problems, lover?" He stood frozen as she planted a quick kiss on his cheek and spun back out of the room. She was going to kill Grace, the words repeated through his mind, barely penetrating the pounding of his pulse. He dropped the phone, held his breath against the thick scent of death threatening to choke him, and pushed through the door. He took 2 steps toward the lobby, following Eve and Grace. Then stopped. Eve was right about one thing. What happened here never happened. Not if Vincent ever wanted to practice medicine again. To ever have the life he dreamed of. The faint sound of a shot pierced his awareness. Vincent turned and ran the other way. Chapter 35 Leap of Faith. Grace fought against the urge to blink. Slowly, control of her muscles returned, but she remained limp in Lukas' arms, waiting until she was certain she was strong enough to escape. This time she would escape, she vowed as he carried her across the skyway and into the annex. He pushed through the open door leading onto the helipad, knocking her head against the metal frame. Sorry, he muttered, swinging around as he searched for an escape route. "Not as sorry as you're gonna be," Jimmy shouted, barreling from the shadows and plowing into Lukas. Lukas stumbled back, slamming into the wall. Jimmy locked his hands around his neck, Grace pinned between them. "Remember me, laddie?" Jimmy sneered as his fingers tightened. Lukas dropped Grace. He brought his hands up, squeezing Jimmy's throat. Grace rolled free. Clouds piled high around them, spewing torrents of sleet and rain on the 2 men locked in mortal combat. Wind whipped the clouds aside for a brief instant, a stream of pale sunlight lancing through the air, pinning the 2 men in a spear of light. "Jimmy!" she called as Lukas reared back, then with the roar of a cornered animal, butted his head against Jimmy's face. "Run, Grace!" Lukas forced Jimmy to take a step back, then rammed his knee into Jimmy's groin. Jimmy's grip on Lukas's neck faltered. Lukas brought his arms up and forced Jimmy's hands away. "She's mine." "You'll never have her, you devil," Lukas shouted. Jimmy charged once more while Grace tried to find her footing. Finally her muscles were obeying her command. But there was nowhere to go. The 2 men blocked the only exit. She looked around for a weapon, anything she could use to help Jimmy. He tore his attention away from Lukas. "Forget about me, Grace. Get out of here." "Damn it, Don't let the bastard win again." Lukas charged him, sending them both to the ground. The two men grappled, rolling in the puddles and gravel coating the rooftop. The exit was still blocked. But there was another way. Grace flexed her fingers. The helipad sat about 10 feet below the rest of the rooftop. If she could climb the brick wall up to the main roof, she could drop down to the skyway's glass roof. There was a hatch halfway along. From there she could get back inside, find help for Jimmy. She ran to the parapet and clawed her way onto the bricks. The mortar joints were rain-slicked and she was out of practice, but momentum and sheer determination kept her moving from fingerhold to fingerhold until she was able to swing herself over the top. She stood, easing her cramped and iced fingers. Jimmy and Lukas were both blooded now, but Jimmy appeared to be losing the fight. Lukas was on top, straddling Jimmy, his knee against Jimmy's windpipe. Jimmy turned his face away from his attacker to look up at Grace. Her eyes welled over with tears. She was going to lose him. Again. Then Lukas would come for her. The wasps swarmed as her stomach roiled with terror. She sidestepped until she was just above the midpoint of the skyway's flat glass roof, gleaming red, as the setting sun battled the storm clouds, then swung herself over the edge. She dangled for a moment, at the mercy of the wind and rain. Sleet, sharp as daggers, lanced into her from every direction. She dropped onto the glass, the impact knocking her breath away. When she looked back, she saw Lukas following in her path, already to the top of the roof above her. Her breath came in panicked gasps. She rolled onto her belly and crawled along the sleet-slicked glass. The thud of Lukas's landing rattled the glass beneath her body. She clawed for any purchase on the unyielding surface, finding only widely spaced thin-rimmed metal supports. "Grace?" Jimmy's voice ripped through her panic. She turned her head and saw that he'd made it to the rooftop above them. Lukas was close, too close. As Jimmy leapt onto the skyway, Lukas snaked a hand out toward her. Jimmy slammed against the glass, the force of his landing almost rolling him off the edge. Grace kicked against Lukas's grip. The madman's mouth was open, the wind shredding his words as he grinned at her in delight, as if this nightmare was the answer to his prayers. He reached his other hand to grab her ankle and began to haul her toward him. Grace allowed herself to slip back close enough to aim a kick against his face. His grip loosened for a moment and she clawed her way forward. The hatch was only a foot or so away, if she could reach the handle. A shot tore through the air. The glass beside Grace's hand splintered into a small star. She raised her head and stared across the void at the helipad. Eve Warden stood there, a very large black gun resting in her hands. She looked confident as she raised it once more and took aim. "No!" Lukas cried, leaping forward to cover Grace's body with his own. The sound of another shot rang out. Lukas' right arm dripped blood. He looked down at the blood and then into her eyes. "I'm sorry, Grace. I should have loved you better." He turned and climbed to his feet, straightening to his full height, shielding her from Eve's deadly aim. "I'll come back," he shouted to Eve. "I'll do what you want, if you leave her alone." Jimmy got to his feet on the other side of Lukas, while Grace eased her way forward. She grabbed the handle to the hatch and twisted it with all her might. The frozen metal burnt the torn skin of her palms and refused to budge. "Sorry, Lukas," Eve said. "It's too late. For both of you." Another shot sliced through the night, ricocheting off the steel housing of the hatch, narrowly missing Grace's face. Grace pulled back, turned her head away. She wrenched her weight against the handle. It groaned, began to turn, then stopped again. Grace yanked once more, felt it give. She pulled herself up to a crouch, and hauled the small glass door open. "Grace, look out," Jimmy called as she felt Lukas's hands push against her back. A fourth shot sounded. Grace caught her balance before she could fall through the opening. She twisted to look around. Lukas stood, towering over her, his chest blossoming blood. I was only trying to save. His words were swallowed by the wind as Jimmy stampeded into him, launching both men to the edge. Lukas's arms windmilled wildly, his expression one of surprise and terror, as he plummeted into the void. Jimmy landed on his belly, but his momentum toppled him over the edge of the icy surface. Grace watched, her throat tight with fear. At the last moment he grabbed hold of the edge, his fingers clawing into the metal framing. Grace ignored the crack of another gunshot. She hooked her feet on the hatchway's inside rim, using it as an anchor, and flattened herself out on the roof, as if it were an icy pond and Jimmy had fallen through. Stretching out to her full length, she was able to grab onto Jimmy's right wrist with both of her hands. Blood dripped from his nose, one eye was already swelling, but still he looked up at her with a smile. Isn't this where we started, love? Stop talking and start climbing, she said between clenched teeth. Don't know how long I can hold on to you. It's all right, Grace. Let me go. She stared at him in horror. No, never. Jimmy, don't ask me. Another shot interrupted her. He slipped further from her reach. Grace clamped her fingers tighter, her arms trembling from the effort. My time is up, he crooned softly. Let me go, love. No, she sobbed. Please, no. I can't lose you again, I can't go on. Sure you can, Grace. You always could. And our love will never die. His smile widened to a grin. We've proved that, haven't we? Outfoxed them all. Even that bastard, Leo. He released his left hand from the roof edge. Laid it on top of her hand, his fingers stroking her naked ring finger. Then he opened the fingers of his right hand. Let me go, Grace. Her shoulders burned in agony as she fought to hold him. He kept his eyes locked onto hers, and in them she saw no regret, only peace. She blinked back tears and opened her fingers. Jimmy slipped away from Grace. It seemed in slow motion at first, the gold of his wedding ring capturing a stray spark of fading sunlight. He plummeted into the shadows, his body spiraling, tumbling, spinning out of control. Spinning into nothing. She craned her head over the edge, saw Lukas's battered body on the pavement 7 stories below, surrounded by a crowd of people. But there was no sign of Jimmy. Chapter 36 Wheel of Fortune. Grace lay on her belly, her thin patient's gown sodden, bunched up around her legs. Rain ricocheted from the glass surrounding her, dripped from her hair into her eyes, chilled her to the marrow. She didn't care, she couldn't move. Pain spiraled into her gut, twisting and burning like a red-hot poker, finally lodging in her heart. It hurt so bad she couldn't breathe, could only swallow ragged gasps of oxygen that cut like broken glass. There was a thud against the roof beneath her, followed by the sound of ice cracking. She rolled to one side. Eve Warden stood below her, inside the skyway now, aiming the gun straight up, trying to shoot through the reinforced glass. Grace blinked away her tears, was almost too tired to fight, to move. She watched as the small star-shaped crack in the glass beside her where the first bullet impacted began to widen, spreading fingers out in every direction, reaching beneath Grace's body. Eve's shout of glee broke through to Grace. The glass exploded. Grace plummeted through the roof and into the skyway. She flailed her arms, heard Eve scream as glass flew, then she hit the floor with a thud. Grace rolled to her feet. Shards of glass surrounded her, blinking in the overhead spotlights. Rain cascaded through the broken roof, rainbows shimmering in the air between her and Eve. Eve's face and arms were covered with small cuts, and glass glittered in her blonde hair. She raised the gun and aimed it at Grace. After everything she had been through, facing this arrogant, homicidal, egomaniac, who had no right to call herself a physician, or a healer, unleashed all the pent-up rage and frustration Grace had been burying for 4 long years. Anger, hot and bright as lava, surged through her. You bitch! Grace straightened, strode through the glass, ignoring its bite against her bare feet. Instead of pulling the trigger, Eve took a step back, the color draining from her face, her aim wavering. Before Eve had a chance to regroup, Grace lowered her head and leapt across the short distance that separated them, slamming Eve against the wall. The gun flew from her hand, skidded to a stop in a pile of jagged glass. The sound of footsteps and voices came from both sides. Grace twisted her head to see Jonas Hellman standing at the annex door, a breathless Cat pushing Alex in a wheelchair beside him. "Grace, are you all right?" Cat called. Eve shoved Grace back and started to run toward the tower. Blocking her path was Vincent, flanked by 2 security guards. Eve stumbled, whipping her head to stare at Grace, then back at Vincent. Grace swayed, gulping frigid air blowing in with the sleet, wiped a stream of blood away from her eyes. "No." Eve's voice came in a harsh whisper, her eyes narrowed to 2 dagger-thin steel ribbons. "Not like this." She surged forward, lunging for the gun sitting on the floor beside Grace. Grace pivoted and dove for the weapon as well, but Eve got there first. Glass cracked and snapped as Eve rolled, bringing the gun up. Grace braced her weight against the other woman's arm. Eve's first shot went wild, sending Vincent and the unarmed guards scrambling for cover. Eve kicked out at Grace, trying to free her gun arm. Their bodies tumbled together, glass shards slicing into them, leaving streams of blood in their wake. Lightning shook the skyway. The thunder that followed boomed through Grace's head, exploding it with pain. Eve's form wavered before her as she tore at the other woman's hand on the gun. Eve's finely honed talons darted out, aimed at Grace's eyes. Grace barely ducked in time, the claws raking her neck. The gun went off again, as Grace slammed Eve's wrist against the window pane. Eve grabbed Grace's fingers, cruelly twisting them to the breaking point, loosening Grace's grip. Scarlet plumes clouded Grace's vision. Her hand grew numb. Eve's 2 hands twisted the gun barrel, aiming it at Grace's face. Distant voices, men shouting, running, swirled around her. Eve's lips parted in a snarl, white teeth glistening as another bolt of lightning streaked through the night. Grace threw her weight forward. A crack tore through the air. The coppery scent of blood and gunpowder choked Grace's throat, gagging her. The rattle of a last breath escaped, collapsing into a sigh. Then silence. Grace found the strength to open her eyes. Rain puddled on the carpet beside her. Vincent reached her, rolled her off Eve's still body. The 2 guards rushed forward, kicking the gun from Eve's lifeless hand. "Grace, I'm so sorry. Are you all right?" Vincent asked, wrapping her in his arms. She pushed free. "Don't you touch me. Don't you dare. You've been through a lot," he said in a low, rushed voice. "When you come to your senses, you'll realize that I didn't have anything to do with it. I did everything I could to protect you. Dr. V, is she all right?" Alex's voice cut through the roaring in Grace's head. "No one will believe you. I have the videos." Vincent's grip on her hand was tighter than a vice. But it was the thundering in her head that made Grace wince. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "I'll give Alex what he wants," Vincent continued his urgent whisper. "Do you understand, Grace? You need to tell them it was Eve, all Eve. I'm innocent." He released. Footsteps thudded all around her, and another man joined them. "I don't like her color," Jonas Hellman's voice crashed down on her like a tsunami. "Her pupils are sluggish. Her pulse is thready," Vincent said, his voice now coming from a very far-away place. "Damn tumor must be hemorrhaging." Grace struggled to focus on Kat and Alex. In the darkness beyond them she swore she saw Jimmy standing over them. Then everything went black. "Pick her up, Embark. We're operating. Now?" Chapter 37 Eye of the Storm. Grace opened her eyes to a haze of colors swirling in a mist around her. Her head pounded, her throat was dry and scratched, and she couldn't feel her body. A tall shadow clouded her vision, then slowly resolved into the form of Brother Leo. So she must be alive. Right? Head hurts, she mumbled. I don't wonder, he said with a smile. His silver hair seemed to swirl with the other colors of the mist that surrounded her. They've been poking around in that brain of yours for going on 4 hours now. Now? She tried to frown but couldn't feel her face. Where am I? Nowhere, came a girl's voice as Brittany appeared beside Brother Leo. Everywhere, Heather added. The in-between, Tiffany pronounced. Grace was growing dizzy from the whirligig of colors blanketing her. Who are you? Clotho, Lachesis, Atropos, those are our real names, Tiffany said. But we like Tiffany, Brittany, and Heather just as well. Now girls, don't go giving it away, Brother Leo said in admonishment. Heather arched an eyebrow and shot him a glare. Who made you boss all of a sudden? You know there's no boss, he stammered. If her head didn't feel like it was about to explode, Grace would have laughed at the sight of the ever-impervious monk being intimidated by the young girl. Or not so young. Clothos, Lachesis and Atropos were the names of the 3 fates in Greek mythology. Grace's mind whirled with confusion. We all play our part, Brittany said, stepping to Heather's side. And we all pay our price, Tiffany finished. The girls stood shoulder to shoulder, and appeared very formidable indeed. Brother Leo spread his hands wide. I know. But there's only so far you can bend the rules. Jimmy knew what he was doing, he made his choice. There's no saving him. Grace's stomach reeled and she choked down acid bile. No? He saved me. Isn't that why you sent him? I'm sorry, Grace, Leo said. Although he didn't sound very sorry. He can't come back, not after killing Lukas. Some rules can't be broken. Jimmy knew that. She blinked back tears. No. I killed Lukas, not Jimmy. Punish me, not him. You don't know what you're saying. I know. Infinity of nothing, hell, call it what you want. It's no worse than what I've already lived through. Leo's face grew grim. He lowered a hand to her shoulder. No. Grace, it's worse. Much worse. I'm sorry. It's impossible. Jimmy's gone. Get a grip, Tiffany said, turning to Grace. Don't listen to him. Anything is possible. Grace smiled, hope speeding her heart. Jimmy's exact words. He's just made because all his work trying to remove temptation can't undo his own free will. Brittany glared at Leo. You fought so hard to change the future, but you can't change yourself, Leo. Heather broke free of her sisters and cupped Grace's hands in both of hers. A flash of light danced between their joined fingers. When they separated, Jimmy's wedding ring lay cradled in the palm of Grace's hand. Remember what Jimmy promised, what you both promised each other, Heather whispered, folding Grace's fingers around the warm band of gold. She straightened and rejoined her sisters. I cut Lukas's life thread before he fell. Before Jimmy pushed him, Brittany added. So Jimmy didn't kill him. Eve did, Tiffany summed up, fists on her hips as she squared off against Brother Leo. He gave in with a grudging smile and mock bow of surrender to the 3 little girls. Grace clutched Jimmy's ring in her hand, the rest of her body relaxing now that she was certain his future was safe. I know who you are, Grace told Leo, staring at the man who was the only father she'd known, the man she'd once called friend. Jimmy said you were the devil incarnate. She couldn't stop the half-smile that twisted her lips. But he beat you, didn't he? That's the problem with molding extraordinary people to live extraordinary lives. They tend to be too smart for my own good. Spare me the false flattery. This is all just a game to use some kind of cosmic chess match with us puny humans as pawns. I hope you had fun. I always try to follow my bliss, Grace. Didn't I teach you that? But it's not a game. And I'm neither God nor devil. Then what are you? Just a man, trying to find redemption. I thought with you I had a chance to save the future, my future. Grace felt her head spin, her vision darken, as she struggled to understand his words. The three girls lined up on her other side, glaring up at the priest. I don't understand. I stopped Lukas, stopped Eve. What more? There are evils greater than Lukas Redding or Eve Warden, Leo said with a bitterness she'd never heard from him before. But you chose to save the children instead of who? She asked when he faltered. Who else was left? Vincent? Was she meant to have chosen Vincent over two children? She's not to blame, Tiffany spoke up. Not for your decisions or your fate, Leo, Brittany continued. Look to yourself to save what you love, Heather finished. Leo's face darkened and he raised a fist, as if to curse, or strike the three girls before him. Grace's heart sped up in panic. This wasn't the Leo Augustine she'd known and loved. What had happened to him? Before she could either ask or receive any answers, Leo's form blurred into a whirlwind of light and color, and he vanished. A quiet calm descended onto Grace. She turned to look at the girls. Who are you? How does this all work? Brittany pursed her lips as if searching for the right words. Think of us as a catalyst. Something that never changes, but helps to propel events, guide them along the way. You're a scientist, you understand the entropy effect. The universe has been on a collision course with chaos since the instant it was born. Without an opposing force, a counterbalance, if you will to hold that chaos in check, everything, time, space, matter, would have spun its way into oblivion eons ago. Tiffany broke in. We are one of many. Even Leo has his place. His uses. He brought you to us, to Alex and Kat, didn't he? So you're trying to tell me it was worth it? It was, Heather assured her. But we know you better than that, Grace. We know you of all people won't take anything we say at face value. So we are going to bend the rules a bit. Again. We are going to give you a glimpse into the world, as it would have been if you had chosen differently. For a moment Brittany's lips were moving, but Grace could no longer understand the sounds emerging. Then, like fine-tuning static from a radio, she could comprehend once more. But the sensation of being lost, unable to function, stayed with her. What's happening? Tiffany frowned, looking past Grace at something she couldn't see. I was afraid of that. Hellman's chosen to be aggressive. He's approaching Wernick's area, the communication center of your brain. I know what Wernick's center is, she said, but the words emerged an incoherent stream of nonsense syllables. As if she was speaking in tongues. Heather reached down, stroked her brow, and suddenly the pain and confusion was gone. It'll be all right, Grace. And, she smiled once more, I don't say that to everyone. The girl's touch was soothing, but Grace wasn't certain she could trust her words. Will Alex and Kat be all right? Kat's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. She'll grow up to be a beautiful and charming woman, mother to many strong children, and champion of the innocent. Thanks to you. If you had left, she would never have finished the download, would have died from the seizure last night. But you chose to stay and saved her. And by the way, her father was one of the original farmers who took Maeve's seeds and harvested them, multiplying a few sackfuls into food enough to feed nations. Tiffany grinned at her. We told him it would be a nice way to give something back, after we arranged for Kat to have her medical care here for free. And Alex. If you hadn't chosen to stay, Eve Warden would have finished her treatment of Lukas. She and Renee Redding would have used Lucidine to change the world in their image. Lukas would have had access to Lucidine, and would use it to destroy countless lives, Brittany said. Alex, what happens to Alex? Grace still heard her words emerging in a jumbled stream, but they seemed to understand her without difficulty. Heather leaned down, her face so close that she could see her own reflected in the girl's fathomless eyes. "Do you remember your wish?" For Alex and Kat. Alex had a wish as well. Grace stared into Heather's eyes and felt like she was falling. "But first you need to make a choice. You must decide, remain in this world long enough to see it revealed or move on to rejoin Jimmy now. It's your choice, Grace." Choice? That was no choice. There was no way in hell she could face this world without Jimmy. Much less bear the pain of losing him again. She opened her mouth to tell them that, but Alex's face, his eyes bright with a smile, intruded itself. His laughter joined with Kat's, a joyous music. "Now, Grace. You need to choose. Now?" Grace tried to shut out Heather's face, her voice, the dark void that had replaced the girl's eyes, drawing her in. She was falling, spinning out of control. Somewhere the blare of an alarm sounded. Then she heard Jimmy's voice, felt his hand in hers. "I'll be waiting," he whispered. "I'll always be waiting, my love." And she made her choice. Chapter 38. In the morning. "Grace, can you hear me?" Vincent's voice broke through the haze that shrouded her mind. She struggled to open her eyes. He wore scrubs, a surgical mask dangling from his neck. She realized she was in the ICU, a ventilator doing the work of breathing for her, force dripping fluids into her veins. Grace closed her eyes. Vincent was the last person she wanted to see. Her brain might be foggy, but she still remembered his betrayal. "I'm so sorry." His words came in an earnest whisper, rustling the hairs on her cheek. "I really do care for you, Grace. But Eve gave me no choice. Don't worry, though. I'm taking over as director of the ECU. Things are going to change. Lucidine has so much potential. That was one thing Eve had right. I'll do better than her, I promise." He paused, cleared his throat, and she felt his hand squeeze hers. "Maybe then, you could." Grace pulled away from his touch, and he sighed. She opened her eyes long enough to watch him walk away, then allowed the drugs to do their work and transport her into a blissful slumber. To her dreams, where she could be with Jimmy until it was time to be with him again forever. Vincent twisted his wrist, glanced at the new Rolex there. Leonard Augustine was 3 minutes late. He tugged his silk tie straight and paced to the wide expanse of windows overlooking the small park beside the hospital. It was a bright April day, marking Vincent's 1-month anniversary as director of the ECU and the Lucidine project. He placed his hand against the glass warmed by early morning sun. The forecast called for record highs. It was already in the 50s, when he'd driven his new Saab convertible into work this morning. He covered a yawn with his other hand. Eve had left a legacy of private clients, who kept growing as word of Lucidine's success spread. And, like Leonard, these clients insisted upon meeting with him in private for their treatments, always before and after business hours, giving him little time for anything except work. Despite moving into a comfortable Shadyside townhouse, he practically lived here in the ECU. His gaze zeroed in on an unusual group traveling down the sidewalk into the grassy expanse of the park. He watched with a pang of regret as Grace spread out a bright plaid blanket. Despite her rejection of him, he still dreamt of her, of what they could have had. At least her operation had freed her from the prison of her fears and agoraphobia. He could take comfort for his role in that. Kat pushed Alex in a wheelchair. He'd meant to visit the children, check in on them, but he'd been too busy. He'd heard from Hellman that Kat was almost done with her rehab, would be going home in another week or so. Also that the ethics committee had approved Alex's DNR and Grace had been appointed his guardian ad litem. No small feat, considering Grace had lost her ability to speak during the surgery that saved her life. He watched her with the children, her graceful movements striking even from this distance. Kat threw her head back and spun around with glee, wavering a little when she put her weight on her left leg. Despite losing her voice, that hypnotic angel's voice that had first attracted him to her, Grace had no difficulty communicating with the two children. He watched as she gently lifted Alex from his chair and made him comfortable on the blanket. Then he realized Alex had no oxygen with him. Grace held Alex on her lap, pointing out the early budding forsythia, crocus and daffodils while Kat sat on his other side, blowing bubbles from a small bottle. Vincent closed his eyes on the scene, his hand still pressed against the glass, trembling as he realized what he was witnessing. Alex's death. And Vincent's failure. "All right, Embark." A man's voice broke through his reverie. "Let's talk turkey. What's it gonna take to get rid of these lousy feelings? I don't have time for all that talk therapy crap, can't afford to lose my edge because of Prozac or any of that other shit. So tell me, what can you bring to the table? What's this new wonder drug of yours I heard about?" Vincent opened his eyes, the tableau below him blurring as he blinked. He spun around, a wide smile creasing his face. "Lucidine," he told Leonard Augustine, a powerful Hollywood advertising executive, certain to be another success story for Vincent. "It will change your world. Forever." Grace's story reminds us that even in the darkest hours, hope and courage can guide us forward. Let our channel be your source of strength. Subscribe and let's light the way together.